Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Jordan LaPier. On the program this week, CBP says border arrests were way up in 2019, a glimmer of hope for bipartisan immigration legislation, and Salvadorans on TPS get a temporary extension. All that just ahead. Before we get started, please remember you can subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you like to get your podcasts. And if you leave us a review, it'll help more people find our show. You can also stream This Week in Immigration on our website at bipartisanpolicy.org/podcasts. And as always, check out bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration for more information on the stories we discuss here on the show. In here with me today, as always, are Theresa Cardinal Brown, Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy, on Twitter at BPC_T Brown. Hi, Theresa.
Hi, Jordan.
And Cris Ramón, Senior Immigration Policy Analyst on Twitter at CRamonBPC. Hi, Cris.
Hey, Jordan. How's it going?
Great. Thank you. All right. First up today, Customs and Border Protection was out last week with its 2019 fiscal year numbers on Southwest border arrests, and the 2019 numbers are more than double those from 2018. We've spent much of the last year on this program and elsewhere talking about a crisis at the Southwest border, and these numbers would seem to back up the notion that the dynamic has certainly changed from early in the Trump administration when border arrests were at a 50-year low. So, Cris, walk us through these latest figures and what they say about migrant flows during the last year.
Yeah, so just to jump right into it, for fiscal year 2019, there were around 852,000 apprehensions between ports of entry at the Southwest border. This is the highest number that we've seen since 2007. We were a little bit smidge higher than 2007 levels. And that's pretty significant because, as you've noted in the introduction, numbers have been pretty low since 2011. I think one of the things that gets lost in this whole discussion is that between 2001 and 2011, you had kind of between an 80-90% drop in apprehensions due to a whole host of factors, but we got pretty decent at being able to manage and control the border. And as we've seen over the last 18 months, what really has driven this is the large number of arrivals of families from Central America. And, we were looking at the stats for FY19, you basically 56% of the border apprehensions were family unit apprehensions. That's really significant because that grew from, 19% in 2016 to what we're seeing right now, which is really significant. So I think not only are we seeing levels that we haven't seen in 10 years, but what we've also seen is a transformation in the demographics of people who are showing up here. And that's been really sort of the core challenge for our immigration system because we really haven't been dealing with this population, even though we've seen similar levels of apprehensions in the past.
The annual border arrest numbers have tended to fluctuate pretty wildly, though. So, Theresa, how much of a conclusion can we draw from looking at just 1 year of data?
Well, what we try to look at is year over year and actually multi-year over multi-year. So within a year, there are definitely fluctuations in numbers, usually due to seasonality. There are fluctuations between ports of entry. So we always say you should never look at month to month necessarily as indicative of a trend, even a 3-month period. And certainly one of the biggest changes during fiscal 2019 took place between May of this year and now and the end of September. May, if you remember, was when we saw the very large 1-month spike and large numbers of family units coming in. Since that time, the numbers have dropped substantially, about 60%. And the Trump administration, of course, is claiming that there's success in those numbers falling. But as Cris said, total for the year are still very high compared to recent lows. So, it all depends on what time period you're looking at. But I think the trends that Cris pointed out are definitely what is most significant about this year and the previous year compared to prior years. But some recent changes that are worth following to see if they continue. One is a significant increase in Mexicans applying for asylum at the border. That new trend seems to have started within the last couple of months. Again, we're not quite sure what's going on there, if it's going to remain and continue to grow. Over the last year, we have definitely seen that the majority of apprehensions are Central Americans and not Mexicans. That is also a significant change from earlier in the 2000s. But again, if we're starting to see an uptick in Mexicans coming in, that dynamic would change. And there was some indication that in September, Mexicans once again may have been the majority of numbers, both single and in family units, but this time claiming asylum. So we look at month to month and those little changes to see it, to follow and see if they signal significant long-term trends and changes. But year over year is really where we see the most dramatic things happening. And again, what happens from here on out? Well, the Trump administration put in a lot of policies to try to address this changing dynamic. We don't know how long they're going to last, and we don't know whether they're going to be short-term changes or affect the long-term trajectory of how people try to get to the United States.
Yeah, because one of the things I've said over and over on this podcast, especially in the last few months, is that if you see the period around the beginning of the new millennium, around 2000, 2001, what you saw persistently over the course of a fiscal year is that you would have these huge spikes and then these huge drops. And the question moving forward is, are we seeing a reversion back to that yearly pattern where you see a huge spike and a huge drop, and therefore going into fiscal year 2020, are we going to see another huge surge and then we're going to see a huge drop, or is it going to be going back to the levels that we saw after 2011, where things are going to kind of maybe calm down a little bit and stay at lower levels? The problem is right now we're kind of in uncharted territory in a lot of ways because we're dealing with a new demographic group and we are dealing with a recent surge from very low numbers. But the thing is, I think this is the question moving forward, is like what happens next. And I think it's really premature for the administration to be declaring victory, because I think FY20 is really going to determine the extent to which everything that the administration has been doing on the border and in the region has worked.
Well, I just add to that, and I think that it's important to remember that when it comes to understanding trends at the border, past is not necessarily prologue. And so you can look back and retroactively recognize trends, but sometimes it's really hard to use what's happening now and as a projection of what might happen in the future.
So CBP this year also reported on a broader metric, what they call enforcement actions. Cris, can you explain what those are and the shift this year and what falls into that category?
Enforcement actions. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky, is that they've sort of started using a very broad catch-all category to encompass a whole host of border enforcement measures or the outcomes of measures that they've taken at the border. The two large categories that you see in the data, one is like border apprehensions. So these are individuals who cross between ports of entry, who were detained by CBP, and then go through the process of removal. And then if the individual seeking asylum, they go through asylum. And we've walked through that a couple of times. There's also individuals who arrive at ports of entry, and the individual presents themselves. This could be ports of entry at the southwest border, and primarily that's where these numbers have been looking at. And then CBP can determine whether the individual can enter the country or not enter the country, depending on whether or not they have proper documentation and so forth. The thing is, where I think it's starting to get a little bit tricky, is that there's a couple measures, one of them primarily being Remain in Mexico, which is a measure where basically we've put individuals in removal proceedings. The individual has made an asylum claim, and we've put them largely into Mexico as they wait through the removal process and the hearing process. The problem is we don't actually really know that well how many of these enforcement actions include this population. We don't know the extent to which this population correlates with individuals who've been deemed inadmissible. We don't know if necessarily they correlate with people who've been apprehended, but it's more like with people who've been declared inadmissible. And it's kind of problematic because, are we double counting individuals? Are we single counting individuals? Enforcement actions is such a large group that with no precision, we don't actually know what's happening to some people, to be honest. It's a little bit strange because for the most part, the border apprehension numbers are pretty good in tracking what happens, but we're kind of entering new territory here.
Yeah, I mean, the Trump administration for the last few years have been issuing southwest border numbers that include both the inadmissibles at the port of entry and the apprehensions between the ports. The apprehensions between the ports have been characterized mostly by the families and the children and people applying for asylum. But inadmissible at a port of entry can include a broad range of people who don't qualify to enter the United States for any reason, not just those who are looking for asylum. So, and CBP hasn't broken out that data. So they haven't necessarily said, oh, the inadmissibles are people seeking asylum. It's people who could be inadmissible for any of the reasons articulated in the Immigration Act. And as Cris said, because the record keeping on the Migration Protection Protocol or the Remain in Mexico people has not been great, if they've been returned to Mexico to wait for their hearing and are coming back for a hearing, CBP may be counting them again. And the reason why we suspect this is because if you look at the inadmissible data, there was huge jump in numbers about the time that they started expanding MPP. And so that, we believe, may have skewed the data. Furthermore, we just got the year-end numbers now, right at the beginning of November. In past years, the year-end numbers have come out usually within a week, maybe 2 weeks of the end of the fiscal year. The month-to-month data would come out within days of the end of the month. The fact that it's taken CBP over a month to, or almost a month, to get us this information indicates that probably they've been looking at this too and trying to figure out what these strange numbers mean. There probably is some data integrity issues here that they need to figure out.
All right, we'll be right back with the latest from Capitol Hill. Now we turn to an increasingly tense and at times bitter debate over the Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act. The bill would eliminate the per-country cap for employment-based immigrant visas, which have created significant backlogs for applicants from countries like China and India. It sailed through the House with bipartisan support earlier this year, and it remains in play in the Senate, but there's a major behind-the-scenes dispute over its merits among immigration advocates. Okay, so who's involved in this debate, and why has it become so intense?
So the Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act, as you mentioned, was a bipartisan bill. It passed the House several months ago with a large bipartisan vote. It passed under something called suspension of the rules, which requires 2/3 of the members of the House to vote for it, and it succeeded in that substantially. There was every expectation that the bill coming to the Senate would also enjoy bipartisan support. Senator Mike Lee of Utah, a Republican, is a primary champion of this and has been pushing the Senate to take this bill up by unanimous consent, which would essentially have the bill go with just about every member supporting it. But in the time since it had passed the House and the time it got to the Senate, as you mentioned, the potential impact of this bill on other migrants waiting in line came to the fore. Now, some things to understand about this bill. As you mentioned, it would eliminate what are called per-country caps. So within the overall limitations on immigrant visas, 140,000 for employment-based immigrants, the statute says that no single country in any given year can have more than 7% of that total, no matter how many people are applying. And as you mentioned, countries like India and China have had the majority of applicants in those categories for the last several years, and that has created very long waits and backlogs, sometimes decades in the making, where individuals who are waiting, they have approval for a green card. They are gone through all of that process, but they can't get the green card until there's a year in which their number is available. So they wait in a very long line along with their spouses and children. Many of those kids that are waiting along with them have spent a long time in the United States. They may have spent 6-8 years of their youth. Now, if they reach age 21 while waiting for that green card, they're no longer eligible for the green card with their parent. They can run out of status. They can be undocumented at that point or have to depart or leave or find their own visa. But the bill, in an effort to try to get bipartisan support, doesn't increase the overall number of visas. And if you don't increase the overall number of visas, but you take away the per country cap, what that means is that for the first maybe 7-8 years, almost all of the available visas will go to the people in the backlog. So if you are from a country that hasn't had a backlog or hasn't had very much of a backlog, this would make you wait. And so this bill has pitted various immigrant groups against each other, and there's been a movement to try to, instead of passing this bill, pass another or get another bill introduced that would expand the overall number of green cards. The fight here is mostly about strategy. The supporters of the Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act say there is very, 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 very little likelihood that we're going to get more green cards out of this Congress or any future Congress in any time coming soon. And in the meantime, you have some countries that are suffering very, very long waits and backlogs and unfairness simply because of where they were born. And they should not continue to have to suffer while other countries or people are able to get in just because Congress won't do its job. The opponents are saying, hey, we should all be fighting for more green cards. And if we all fought for more green cards, we might be able to get it. This is a matter of tactics and strategy as well as reality, but it is creating divisions.
Doesn't it also come down, though, to a question of what exactly fair means when it comes to legal immigration changes?
I mean, that's really kind of what part of this debate is. It's not only just tactics, but what does fair mean for people who've been waiting for a very long time? And I think this is where it's gone from tactics to something that's pretty visceral and emotional. Because if you're somebody from India and China, you've been waiting decades. The fact that you can now wait for a little, for your wait time is decreased. That's great. And that means that feels fair to you. But if you're somebody who's been benefiting from a shorter wait time and now your wait has to increase by a couple of years, that doesn't seem very fair. And that's the problem with sort of within the immigration system, is that any immigration system is going to pick winners and losers. I mean, that's writ large for any type of institution. And I think right now the problem is that our immigration system has sort of gone down a specific path, that this is sort of the status quo, and whenever you're going to change up the status quo, those who have benefited from it may not like what they see, and they may perceive it as unfair. But to reiterate, it's really visceral and emotional. Theresa and I have been saying this on Twitter, both not only the immigrants themselves, but immigration lawyers that represent both sides have really just exchanged in really, really, really pitched battles and skirmishes, and exchanging some pretty brutal words.
Yeah, and so Senator Dick Durbin, who was a sponsor of a previous version of this bill in a previous Congress, has now introduced his own legislation that would broaden the number of green cards and eliminate the per-country caps as well. And people are saying that he's somebody that has turned on the issue and are now going after him personally for having been a supporter and not. So as Cris said, it's getting kind of nasty. But the overall sort of point of this is pitting some different arguments against each other. As you mentioned, what is fair, but also when we're talking particularly about green cards that are supposedly based on an immigrant's skills and abilities and job offer, what is the point of having country limitations? If we go back to the roots of our current immigration system in 1965, this per country limit, the 7%, was seen as more fair than prior national origin caps that had capped countries by basically who we preferred to have coming into the country. And so before 1965, the country of origin caps were based on previous census data. They strongly favored European immigrants over immigrants from Latin America or Africa or Asia. And the idea of giving every country the same number of visas was meant to be fair. But it doesn't turn out that way. Fair in intent and fair in outcome are two different things. And what has happened in outcome is that you have countries with wildly different populations and with wildly different demands in terms of visa coming to the United States, having the same number of visas. So it's not really based on any other perception than everybody. So a country like India that has hundreds of thousands of applicants has the same number of visas as Brunei, which may have 100. Is that fair? Is that not fair? It depends on where you sit. But if we're not in a situation where we're going to see any legislation, any comprehensive immigration legislation for any near term, and this bill has a chance to help some people, they're arguing, why should we have to continue to wait until everybody can benefit if there's an opportunity for us to get better treatment now?
So what happens next? Is there a way to put the genie back into the bottle, so to speak, and get back to that place of broad bipartisan support for this legislation?
I think it's hard to see, as Cris mentioned, right now within the advocacy community, it's a pretty much pitched battle, and there's a lot of acrimony going around. I think that there's a couple of things that could happen. Perhaps there's a deal made in Congress that would find some way of eliminating the per country caps and granting the people in the longest wait lines a faster process without necessarily penalizing other people. That would be rejiggering the bill in a new and different way. It may mean that everybody has to wait longer. Who knows? I don't know how that's gonna come out. And of course, if that happened in the Senate, it would have to go back to the House and try to be passed there. The other thing is that these parties may come together and see if they can make a concerted push for just more green cards overall. I think that's unlikely to happen in this Congress. I kind of agree with those who say that's asking for the moon right now, and the moon's not going to happen. So I think there are some bipartisan paths forward, but it does indicate the trickiness of the details of our immigration policy and trying to find even a narrow path forward on an issue that can be so contentious.
Yeah, and I think this shows some of the limitations of kind of taking this narrow approach of piecemeal reforms. Obviously, you want to be able to fix the system however you can, but if in absence of a broad, comprehensive effort where you can kind of be able to pair up the expansion of green cards or think about the limits of legal immigration to this country, along with limiting the per country caps. If you can't do that and you're only relying on these piecemeal measures, you're going to come across these limitations, these political ones.
All right, after the break, a new deal to extend TPS for Salvadorans. Stick around. Finally, today, in late October, the Trump administration extended protections for Salvadorans in the United States on temporary protected status for another year. But rather than extending those protections unilaterally, this move was part of a package of agreements with the Salvadoran government. So, to start, can one of you explain briefly what TPS is and who typically qualifies?
So temporary protected status is a provision of immigration law that allows the government to protect from deportation and grant work authorization to nationals from a country that has had something significant happen that makes it difficult for their nationals to return home. It could be a natural disaster. It could be a outbreak of violence or civil war. It could be other types of conditions. And it has been used over time for many different types of countries. For El Salvador, as well as other Central American countries, originally they may have been designated at this point in time more than 2 decades ago based on hurricanes or severe mudslides or other natural disasters that hit their territories. It had been extended over time continuously by administrations of both parties. But the Trump administration earlier this year decided to terminate these programs for most of the countries that had been so designated, Salvador being one of them. Those terminations have been stopped by the courts. So the courts are temporarily keeping temporary protected status alive, if you will. In the meantime, the United States has negotiated agreements with El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, which are also the countries sending the most immigrants to the southwest border. They had negotiated agreements with them on asylum and immigration enforcement in those countries. And so this agreement with El Salvador, apparently the Salvadoran government asked for this extension as part of the deal.
So let's cover 2 parts here. First, what the new terms of TPS are for Salvadorans who are here, and then I want to get into the complications around the agreement because I know that's a bit confusing too. So let's start with the new terms.
Sure. So as I mentioned, the Trump administration had moved to terminate temporary protected status for Salvadorans and Hondurans and others. The courts have stopped them from ending it. And in the meantime, the United States government had agreed to extend their work authorization at least till January 2020, which was when they thought the court cases would be done at that time. Pursuant to this agreement, as we understand it, they have now agreed to extend it for another year or another year past whenever the final court decision is. It's not a redesignation of TPS per se, and it's not an extension of the TPS. It is a extension of the existing work authorizations, I guess is one way to say it, For people on the ground, though, it means a little bit longer breather before they have to worry about whether or not they might have to leave the country.
Okay, so there's all kinds of caveats and question marks that you're putting around this explanation. Can you get into why this is so confusing and what the questions are around exactly what this agreement is?
I think part of the issue is the way it was rolled out. That the morning of the day that this was announced, the Salvadoran president, Bukele, made an announcement saying that TPS was extended. That's forgivable in the sense that, sometimes you don't expect an elected head of state from another country to kind of know the intricacies of our immigration system. But he went out on social media, on Twitter, and said it was extended. And then
the USCIS director said, wait a minute, we haven't actually extended TPS. We agreed to extend the work authorization of these people, which is a little bit of a semantic difference. But because the Trump administration is defending itself in court on the termination of TPS, if it were to say we extended TPS, that would undercut its legal arguments. So they're trying to thread a fine needle here.
Not that we want to bring this all the time in the podcast, but obviously other issues related to quid pro quos with foreign governments. Not a good look, but that is the trickiness of this, is just sort of the understanding of what was agreed on. And I think the fact that this ongoing litigation just presents, I think, a lot more complications than, say, DACA, where the program was eliminated, there was litigation, but the litigation froze more or less what was happening, and people can sort of begin renewing their status. This is, I think, a lot more complicated.
It is a lot more complicated, in part because, as I said, the U.S. government have moved to terminate. They're still fighting that battle in court. But I will say that of the governments in Central America, El Salvador probably has had the most extensive and persistent lobbying of the U.S. government on TPS status for its nationals of all of the Central American governments. This is a very, very important thing for them. It's worth noting that it makes that remittances from TPS and other Salvadorans in the United States makes up a significant portion of the GDP of El Salvador. The protection of their people in the United States is a big issue for them. And the embassy and consulates in the United States have really been leaning on the U.S. government to extend TPS every time it's been up. So it's not a surprise for me, and I think for others who've been watching this, that the Salvadoran government and President Bukele may have made some nod to the TPSers, a condition of signing some of these agreements to help on asylum and other issues.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that really kind of speaks to the power of diplomacy, to be honest, in one of these outcomes. I mean, I think one of the things that we did here in the lead up to the termination decision is that some other embassies weren't being that active in lobbying, but we've seen this up close here in D.C., that the Salvadoran embassy has been extremely active. And then, because one of the other concerns that they have too is that if they have a sudden influx of TPS arrivals, the type of reverberations that might have in their own job market. One of the things that they're really concerned about is the arrivals of individuals who have worked in the United States, have skills, have knowledge, and the potential impact that could have on their labor markets, and also receiving the children of these TPS holders who have grown up in the United States and how they would go about with integrating this. So there's sort of the concerns about getting remittances, but there's also the concerns about receiving a population that potentially could displace a lot of Salvadorans from the job market.
Okay, and finally, where do things stand with that legal battle that you mentioned around the Trump administration's broader effort to end TPS kind of more broadly?
So as I mentioned, several federal district courts have issued injunctions on behalf of at least 4 nationalities that grants continuation of their existing status in the United States. Those remain going through the system. The decision on the merits have not been issued by any of those courts, and the injunctions are still in the process of being appealed. So for now, it's on life support. There are other countries that are, but the temporary extensions that the USCIS gave go to January 2020. They would have to extend those again if the court cases are not settled. It's also worth noting that there was a statement by the Honduran government within the last couple of days in response to all of this saying, well, our understanding was that the government would be extending these proceedings anyway, so we didn't necessarily say anything about it at the time. I think there's a little bit of a, hey, it's not like we forgot about our nationals either. Who knows? But I think that the long and short of it is, I'm sure the advocates in those cases are looking at what happened here and trying to figure out if there's a way they can use it in litigation. But for the members who have TPS, it's still a holding pattern. There's no long-term fix here yet.
All right, that's a good place to leave it, Theresa. Cris, thanks for joining me. We'll be back in 2 weeks. In the meantime, please take a second to find us on Facebook by searching Bipartisan Policy Center or on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. And don't forget to subscribe and leave your feedback on this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search Bipartisan Policy Center. This episode of This Week in Immigration was written by Cris, Ramón, and myself and produced by Yafat Tawahara. That's all for now. Join us again next time on This Week in Immigration.